Welcome back. So in this video I wanted to have a little bit of a chat about JSX. So if you remember, JSX is this representation of HTML that we've got. We also said that it isn't actually HTML, and what actually happens is that this gets rendered into JavaScript calls. I'll show you some of that in a moment, but one of the things that this is great for, JSX, is that it makes composition of elements really straightforward. You can basically have one component that's made up of multiple different components. So to just show this, if we create another function here and we call this hello, and within this function we're just going to say, right, we want to return literally a span, and it just says hello, and then that's our first component done. The next thing that we want to do is, let's say if we've got another component here called world, and then again we want to return one component that's a span, and it just says world. Pretty basic stuff, right? So then that means in this hello world component, rather than doing it this way, we could, for example, have this h1, and then within the h1 we could have hello, and then you could have world as two separate components. If we refresh this, as you can see, it's basically rendered this up here again, so it's just the same. So this is how we build up bigger components. It's a case that we just build them up from lots of small components that have one responsibility or very little responsibility. Having giant components is never really a good idea, and it's much better to compose our components into much bigger things by using smaller ones. One thing to note, that when we return our JSX, you might see that we've got this wrapping div here. Let's see what happens, for example, if we remove, let's just remove the h1 as well, and just remove this div here. If we just bring this in a little. So essentially, now what we're doing is we're returning two components. If we refresh this, you basically get this error message. That might be a little bit too small. Let me just see if I can pump that up a touch. It says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. What that basically means is that when we return any JSX, we can't return two sibling items next to each other. We can only return one item. So the way that we would actually return both of these would be to wrap them in a div. So if we take this div and we put this div inside here, if I just refresh this, there we go. As you can see, it now loads the page. One thing about this approach is it causes what's called div soup. If we look into the actual code here, again, I'll try and expand this a little bit. If we look into the actual code, you can see that we've got this unnecessary div, and that can sometimes be a pain. You can kind of have this situation where you've basically got these wrapping divs pretty much around everything, and the only reason that they're there is so that you can return them. React came up with a solution for this by adding something called Fragments. So what you can do is you can change this div to what's known as a fragment. So let's change this. Oops, got two fragments there, sorry. So now once you return this fragment here and you've got these two components, you can see you've got hello and world. And if we just inspect this, if we look in here, we've got the element of root, and then seemingly we've got two components here. And what you'll notice is that there's no span that wraps around it. So this is really good for getting rid of div soup. One of the benefits with this as well is that there's a shorthand way of writing this. In React, you can just do this and then close it with this. This is exactly the same thing. This just basically means create a React fragment and then put this content in it. It's up to you which way you want to go with creating these. I kind of lean towards doing the longer way, mostly because I think it's just a bit more obvious what it is. There's something quite jarring as a developer to see this, at least in my mind, but I mean, you know, I can understand people being happy with it that way. That's fine. So the key point to remember is that whenever you return some JSX, it has to be one thing that comes back from it. You can't return multiple. If you do want to return multiple, either wrap it in something like a div, or you can wrap it in something like a fragment, So the reason that we do it this way with JSX is because it's just a lot easier for us developers to look at. The alternative would be to do something like this. You would do React.CreateElement, and then from within here, so if you wanted to create a div, for now we'll have no children within there, and then let's just say this is some content. And then if we save that, it will then put that there. The other option then is to then nest all these create element calls, and it just gets a complete mess. So the reason that we use JSX is so that we don't have to write these directly, and then when we do all our transpiling, the actual React JSX statements that we type in will basically then get compiled into these calls here, so they all get compiled down to this at the end of the day. Another thing to notice is that when we create our JSX, you'll see that we've got these parentheses. Now these aren't strictly necessary, so if we just take these out, if I just show you this error first and save this, as you can see it says failed to compile. Now the reason it's doing that is because it can't work out what's the beginning and what's the end. So to help it a little bit, you can do this. Now this works because it's basically saying that this is the start and this is the end. It's to do with where the actual elements start and where they finish in terms of they line up with each other. If you were to move this down, then this is not valid syntax because it needs to be on the same line. You could do it if you had brackets, but in this case we don't have brackets, so it's invalid to move it down a line. The other thing that we can do is that we can put expressions in our JSX. So these could be in the form of variable names, they could be simple expressions like just strings and integers. But if we just add in some parentheses here like this, and we type in hello again, just here, then as you can see, it adds the hello again text at the top there. Now, what you can do is you can also make these conditional. So if we had a variable that was, say, true, and you wanted to show something where it was, let's just say, paid, and this is the ternary operator, okay? So you would say this is paid or unpaid. So if we do this, if I just get rid of these for a second, as you can see, it comes up with paid, but say if the variable was false, then it would show unpaid. So this is how you do conditional logic within the template within JSX. There is another way of doing this. So for example, if you had something that was, say, is valid, so you would kind of do like true, and then you could say, let me just put this here, you could say valid, like so. So this is essentially saying if this is true, then we'll say it's valid. If it's false, then it won't show it. Another thing to note is that we can type comments in here. Now comments are a little bit cumbersome. I don't use them very often, to be fair, because I don't know. I don't think they're the greatest looking things. And then you would type this is a comment in here. And obviously you don't see that comment. If you look in the HTML, it's not anywhere in here. So this is just a comment that gets stripped out when we transpile it. The final thing I wanted to mention about JSX is the fact that everything needs to be closed. So if I show you what I mean by this, so we're calling this hello world component here, and this is the actual hello world component. If I just roll this back so that it was where it was, just bear with me 1 second. Here we go. So if we roll this back, take it all the way back, and we've got our hello world component here. Now as you can see, we've got these backslashes here. If we don't have those in there, then that's going to fail. This catches a lot of new people out because they're not self-closing. If you wanted to just do like this, and then close this, that's valid, you can do that. But most of the time, we just do self-closing on our components. So it's a self-closing tag like this. So you've got a couple of options there, but one thing to always check is that you're self-closing. If you're not self-closing, you'll get this error where it says parsing error, expected corresponding JSX closing tag for world. So it's pretty obvious what that means. So that's it, guys. That's all I wanted to talk about with JSX. You've now got the fundamentals of it, and it's pretty easy to work with. It's a lot easier than doing the JavaScript alternative using CreateElement, because that's just not workable, I don't think, in most cases. So that's it, guys. I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers.